Well, now here are some imperfect reflections on Tales of the Round's Table by Zach and Jan Porcu. And I say imperfect, partly because I'm not sure where to go with it. That's a good thing because I don't want consulting to be a set of specific recommendations. I'm not rewriting anyone's game for them. But often the reflections kind of point in a way or at least show you where I'm coming from. This time, I'm not so sure. Okay, so I've played this thing twice in the last week, and the first time, which is what I'm talking about face to face, the second one's actually recorded, and you'll see that too. But the first time was at KimCon, and with three willing and able folks, sat down to try it out, and I explained at the outset that this was intended to be a teaching tool. The idea was that we would do as instructed and see what we think one at least might learn from it. You can't really put yourself into the naive state of minds that the game is designed to target, but people were aware that that's what we were going in to do. So there's one very relevant aspect of this, because at KimCon, people often bring games that are quirky, and they're pretty sure that they're not really going to get much of a chance to try them out elsewhere, or at least if they do it here, they'll have a particularly receptive audience. I also want to say that this group of people is extremely low bullshit, and if a cool, quirky, innovative, different, ambitious, perhaps game comes along, it's not going to get insta-cred. There's a real appreciation for system responsive instrumentation in this group, and several games that we played, as I'll have in more videos, several of them fell short. Not because they weren't good ideas and not because they weren't all manner of indie in the most aggressive marketing sense of the term. Little short of, okay, now this person sits on your knee and narrates this part of the conflict, and then you stand on your head and narrate the outcome. I mean, little short of that. So we had noted in discussions already that a lot of these had some very interesting premises, very fun things to do, and then what made it good was realizing that there wasn't much to work with and taking it upon yourself. So supplying a great deal of the structure, constraints for one another, habits of tossing information to one another, seeing what you do with it, receiving it back. Good habits of play, to be sure, but those habits were carrying the weight of actually coming to what we found fun. So the question is, what about Tales of the Round Table? Because in many ways, the question is completely the reverse. What we have here is structure, structure, and more structure, and it's intended to operate as a scaffold. Think of building a wall. You build a scaffold, and you build the bottom of the wall by standing on the ground, that is to say, at the capabilities that you have, is that analogy, and then you get it a little higher on the scaffold, so you're standing higher than you can by yourself, and that permits you to build the wall to that height, and you have built the wall to that height. The scaffold helped you do it, but the scaffold in and of itself isn't going to be the wall. And furthermore, it's a temporary structure. It will go away. It was a serviceable, necessary piece of being able to build the wall. So bad teaching is either not to provide a scaffold at all and saying, why, do it yourself, active learning, yay, and you can't do it yourself. You can build it to your capability, and you can do that over and over again, but that's all you can do. Another form of bad teaching is simply to, show you the wall, put you in front of it and say, memorize that. And of course you have no capability of building a wall after that either. And then there are other forms too of bad teaching. One is to get on the scaffold with you and do it for you, and then say, see, we did it. You can do it now. All sorts of things. The analogy holds very nicely. Good teaching should be good scaffolding. So with that in mind, what does Tales of the Round Table do? The structure is round and round. You have 4 people, and one at a time plays one of the 4 designated protagonists, whom each one has, character ownership there. And then there's a routine of interaction with their oppositional player who's seated across from them, not necessarily playing their own character. And they have a mandated back and forth. It's actually quite brief. And then the people on either side have provided, crucially, the immediate setting and available items and details, which is actually a big deal, because you've said what your protagonist is trying to do, whom you're approaching, what you're trying to achieve with it in a general way. There's some listed options. The opposition has been named, and the player of that opposition has said why doing that is going to be hard. What's the basic problem at hand? So there's a certain amount of abstract scene construction there, and then we have the stage setting. Then not quite free play. There's mandated content of exchange. Then each person's going to roll a die, and the 2 people watching actually are going to provide 1 or 2 dice to one side. So you can't split your dice between the 2. You can't abstain from voting, but you do get to choose who, and you get to choose whether it's 1 or 2 dice. So either side rolls anywhere from 1 to 5 dice against the others. And so you see who's got the higher die. So that's the sort of the basics of the interaction, and it rotates. So each protagonist gets, their day in the sun. Now, the original design that I saw had 3 go rounds, so that would be 12 episodes. The form that I took off to KimCon and have played again is 1 round. So this is it. This is your chance. You play in this person and this situation, and that's what you have to work with. After that, there's a final vote on several crucial questions. In this vote, everybody is equal, and nobody's left out. Nobody's sitting waiting for the vote. Everybody votes, and there's 4 questions, and they have to do with Arthur and Guinevere getting married. They have to do with the fate of Camelot. They have to do with the relationship to Fairy and several other things. Well, anyway, so given those outcomes, yes and no, then the epilogues, or sort of the dispositions, better, for each of the characters is stated by their owners, and that's the end. It is incredibly reliable. It is rather unbreakable in the sense of doing its thing. Now, is the thing an effective scaffold? Does it build the wall for you? It's a scaffold in the sense that you're standing on it and you're doing something that you don't know how to do, but then does it do it for you? Is it that kind of beta level, at best, teaching? So that's a really difficult question, because of course you can't look and say, okay, we did the wall, so we got it. You can't say to yourself, well, I was involved in doing this, because in that kind of bad teaching, the instructor is on the scaffolding with you and you are doing things. It's just that anything really important is managed already. So anyway, putting that analogy aside for the moment, the question is, what about the good side? The good side is that you get a lot of freedom to muck with the basic dynamics that are set up. There's 4 protagonists, each of which is reasonably, either implied to be or explicitly motivated for the good in terms of that specific issue. For example, Una, Queen of the Fairies, wants to keep the realms united and in harmony. So that's, between mortals and fairy. Fine. You have also got 2 antagonists, one military, one magical, who can be drawn in by the oppositional player anytime they want, or even by the protagonist player if they're actually attempting to directly interact with them. One might say, well, I'm going to go and slay Prince Riance. That'll solve that problem, and that's your plan going into the scene. So there's all kinds of different things. You could try to soften his heart. The point is that the outcome ends up being quite interesting in terms of the vote. A couple of interesting things have occurred due to the vote and the fact that the vote only affects the dice. So you're not actually voting on the outcome in the traditional sense of voting on policy. You're voting by simply affecting the statistics of what's getting rolled. And dice, of course, will do as they do. Well, the outcomes that we had at the KimCon game were generally pretty positive. I'd have to say that it was kind of a fairy tale ending for the most part, and that's fine. We played in a couple of different ways. We played in a couple of plot twists through the options that weren't just fairy tale, and in a couple of places the dice easily could have bounced the other way, kind of a split decision on the dice more than once during the turns and especially at the end. So that meant we had a real fortune-heavy use of outcomes. That means that we were handed things that then you have to process mentally and say, okay, now how does that work with everything we know? How could that not have turned out okay? Okay, in saying so. So that's one thing I really liked about it, is the fact that you're being very responsive to the dice. And certain turns can occur without dice. And that's if, for example, the antagonist offers a price to the protagonist player and they go for it. Usually that price, at least when I was present, I tried, see, this is a question, am I interjecting myself in as instructor at this point? I said it's very important that when you offer a price, that it is a permanent turning point for that character. It's not just, donate to the poor and I'll do it, this time. It's something really changes. And they do give examples and principles for that I think I was being consistent with. But as a participant, really laying it down during play, if you're going to offer a price, it's got to hurt. And it's not just a promise. You'll see in the recorded session that one of the players was sort of trying to get out of it by making a promise to do something, and looking at the text of the rules, it wasn't going to let you do that. Well, so you can have these big plot shifts from people accepting prices, not to mention just what the protagonist might want to achieve and whether it does or doesn't happen. And then you also have the outcomes of the dice playing a big role, and nobody knows what another person's going to say, and nobody knows what the dice are going to do. I mean, in the crunch, we can say it's more or less likely, but 4 dice on 1 or something like that. But you know how that goes. Well, there's several other nuances to this. One is backstory. For example, going in, that Guinevere and Arthur's romance, this is pre-marriage, their romance is a little bit rocky. Well, sooner or later, someone may come up with some content for that. What is up with that relationship? Of all the different things that could be wrong or up or just not quite resolved or needs a little work or something, of all those things, they're going to vary pretty far across a moral spectrum. And people's response to that content is a big deal. So there's room for a lot of, I would say, disproportionate input at that point, which may not really be a bad thing. After all, at least a person's doing it on their own and isn't choosing it off of a list or something like that. Well, anyway, as far as the fun goes, no question. I mean, people at the end, we looked at each other and said, hey, I think we did a good job with this. This was fun. And we couldn't have been another story given who we were and how the dice fell. And it could have been another story with other people here or on a different day or slightly different interpretations and, of course, the way the dice fell. So the contingent aspects of what goes in as well as what comes out are both incredibly important for the function of this game, and as such, I didn't see any, reason to think otherwise. In other words, it's a good wall. The question remains, and especially with the counterexample of the other games in which the purpose was different. They weren't to teach role-playing, so they weren't an equivalent comparison in terms of purpose. But they were very instructive in providing just enough structure to make us need a little bit more and say, all right, if only there'd been like one more clincher. You see, that's kind of the interesting thing. With a lot of the games designated indie, they have the opposite problem in that they're hideously over-engineered, and you roll for losing your temper, and then if you get an 4 on the die, then you go and you look up 4 on the table, and that means that you're mad about this, and so then you get a point in that, and you fill it in on your sheet, you get enough points in that one thing, well then that mandates, a murderous action, and whatever. You get kind of this, not to be too mean about this, but kind of a play itself basic Settlers of Catan problem. You turn the cubes around, the cubes get passed around to different people, and the points get filled in, and the turn goes, and you roll another die and move the thing, and then it all kind of just clockworks away. Those are not very interesting to me, and I am loaded for bear with telling you anything that's wrong with a game like that. I'll just come along with my mallet. But this is a little different. We were looking at games that were sort of a little more like the stereotype of the poetic ass loosey goosey thing. Wow, this is really surreal and cool and vague and misty. And you're like, okay, I can do all that. I'm doing all that. Now it looks as though we're just pitching and catching to one another, and we're just going to have to do it well, or else we're going to have wasted 2 hours. So it's very interesting to contrast that with what I'm seeing with Tales of the Round Table. I think you can probably see now why I'm uncertain. I have these corners, these conceptual corners that I'm lining up, or at least juxtaposing and seeing where Tales of the Round Table is. The good news, no surprise, this has been observed by the authors already. Naive players, people who don't know nothing about the game, sit down and open the box and play, and they end up at the end going, wow, we made a really cool story. This was all right. I feel like I did something here. So all of that is excellent. The scaffolding question remains. So let's keep that in mind as we proceed further and carry it on with observing the recorded session. And instead of trying to break the game, we want to see actually what it's doing. It's not that easy when you're not in the naive audience yourself. The essence of teaching in the long run is not whether you completely delivered the topic. I would say to fellow profs, what do you think of this class you're doing? And they say, well, I know I'm covering the material. And that was like their thing. It ain't good teaching. The question is whether the people who walk out of the class can, in the short run, but preferably in the long run, exhibit their own critical capacity toward this material and be enhanced in their understanding of the world and of things they can do. Well, that's what we're after here. Wishes Ak and Jen luck. There's a lot of weight riding on that. What if the game works but they don't like it? What if they would like it, but we screwed up and it doesn't really work? And then you can go on from there for all the other ways. It has to be right every possible way, right? That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. I'm also going to see if we can find a way to relieve that pressure a little bit and say, okay, look, the game has failure states through usage, just like a musical instrument does. and let's let that be real too. So, onwards.